On the morning of the day after we weighed anchor in Bremerhaven to return to the United States, the report on the bridge said in bold letters, "Hurricane force winds." The storm veered considerably further east than expected, and with 350 nautical miles between us and the possibility of returning to Germany, we had to seek shelter in the harbor of Portsmouth, England. There was nothing wrong with this in case of an emergency, except that protocol meant waiting in line to go out to sea again. However, the order was clear: head to Portsmouth and wait for a new sailing time. Molly Saint, registered in Panama, is a 260-meter-long container ship carrying 6,252 of cargo on this voyage, mostly industrial goods and components for auto plants in the United States. This was my 18th flight across the Atlantic and back to Molly. When we dock in Charleston, I have a decision to make: stay or retire with 30 years of service and an accrued pension and health care benefits. Standing at the port handrail, I watched as the harbor pilot climbed aboard to take control of the bridge and navigate Molly across the canal to the pier. This is a common practice required in most major commercial ports. Roger Chaffee is a pilot, and I have known him since his time at Southampton Harbor, and as a fellow seaman many years ago, one of the best specialists. Good to see you, Max. When we're done here, we'll go grab a bite to eat and have a pint at the ferry, eh? He announced rather than asked, and I never refused his hospitality. Of course, we'll go, I laughed. Later in the evening, when my deputy was on duty, I met an old friend in the pub Ferry House Inn. Over the best fish and chips in the South, we reminisced about old times and told each other tall sea stories from both sides of the ocean. "Well, how is your beautiful wife doing in the Holy City?" he asked me after we had told 100 stories about our adventures. He noticed my pause and must have seen the pain in my eyes. He himself went through this a couple of times. Such is the life of a sailor. He shook his head in sympathy. "We separated a couple of flights ago. I found someone else to keep her warm while I was at sea." "Damn, buddy, this is a tough job," he said, and called the waitress to bring us a glass each. For good women, wherever they are, and about the rest, as you Yankees say, to hell with them. Roger was right. But I always thought Tammy Waters was a good woman for a long time, until she became someone else. 6 months ago. "Damn it, it's nice to feel solid ground under your feet again," I said to my first mate, dragging my bag behind me. He was going to Greenville, and we were supposed to meet again in 6 weeks. Crew and another captain, Molly, were going to take her on a voyage to South America and back as soon as the ship was loaded. "I can give you a ride, Captain." "It's not a problem," he said, squeezing his young wife. I agreed, and he dropped me off at City Market, where I bought Tammy a dozen roses white, long-stemmed, her favorite. We arrived at the port a couple of days early, and I wanted to surprise her. I usually called her from the plane a day or two before returning to find out what she was planning. The area was full of tourists and students from the College of Charleston, and the aroma of countless culinary delights filled the air in the open-air markets and streets around us. I moved into the area a couple of years after Hurricane Hugo left its mark on this beautiful city and found a town home on Anson Street for the lowest price. The New Jersey owners seemed to have had enough of our subtropical climate after a storm ripped off part of their old roof. Their loss became my gain. With considerable effort and perseverance over several years, I brought the house up to par with the historic charm of the area. With the help of an experienced blacksmith, we restored all the wrought iron fences along the street and in the garden. When the work was completed, it was a 3-story pastel pink townhouse with dark green hurricane shutters, and there was no one to live in it. I spent 10 weeks at sea and 6 weeks in port. For a 26-year-old marine engineer who had only completed his apprenticeship a couple of years ago, I thought I did pretty well. Tammy Waters showed up a few years later, ringing the doorbell. I expected to see another college student who was supposed to replace the girl who had recently graduated and gone home. After leaving the house empty the first few times I went out to sea, I couldn't stop worrying about it. One of my friends suggested renting out rooms to trusted tenants. I found enough suitable candidates among the college students. I rented out 2 rooms on the 3rd floor to several girls. When one of them was released, the other found a replacement, so I expected to see a new tenant when I opened the door. Mr. Banyan, good afternoon. I'm Tammy Waters. I understand that you are planning to rent a room to my sister, Patty Waters. She stood there with an expectant expression on her face as I opened the door, inviting her in. Yes, she seemed like a nice girl, and she was recommended by a young lady who recently moved out, I replied. Well, I promised her to check everything. You can't be too careful now. I offered her something to drink, and, to my surprise, she chose an IPA, which greatly improved my opinion of her family. I was even more impressed by her vibrant beauty. She reminded me of a young Catherine Zeta-Jones, dark hair, full lips, ample breasts. She looked around the room, and I gave her a tour of the house, ending with a narrow patio at the back of the house. I decorated this small space with a few plants and potted flowers. In the soft evening light, the garden looked very romantic, but in the 90-degree midday heat with Charleston humidity, it was far from romantic. However, she liked it, and I invited her and her sister to dinner the next night. Several dates followed, and we soon became one of those semi-obligatory couples who go with the flow of life until someone forces us to make a choice. At that time, this was not necessary. Tammy understood my naval career. Her father was a naval sailor. She worked as an assistant professor of fine arts in college and was on her way to obtaining a tenure-track position. We both loved this city, and so she decided to stay here if the opportunity arose, and we settled into the comfortable environment that our circumstances allowed. We were together for almost 3 years before she decided to move in with me and rent out her small bungalow on the west bank of the Ashley River. At that time, I was 35 and an engineer in line for promotion to senior officer. Living together was strange, even though I had been renting out rooms to female students for almost 10 years and continued to do so after Tammy moved out. Over the years, I have had no shortage of female company, although I have always been cautious around the girls living in the house. Some found it strange, others felt a certain excitement from the fantasy. I was just enjoying life. It was the same with Tammy. We were both not innocent when we met, and our intimate life has always remained vibrant and satisfying. By the time of our wedding, I was 40, and she was almost 36. We did not have children. She could not have them for medical reasons, although she seemed to have come to terms with this at the age of 20. Given our lifestyles, this has never been a problem for either of us. I admit, over the years there have been temptations. This is part of life. I've visited more than 100 ports, from Charleston to East Asia, and even on the outskirts of the Pechora River in cold Russia. In most ports, there are always women ready to meet. However, with rare exceptions, when I was free, I always avoided temptation. Tammy, too, faced temptations at home and at college among many men while I was at sea for weeks at a time. We had an agreement. We didn't cheat on each other because we didn't want to. Of course, either of us could break this rule and the other would never know, but we trusted each other. After several years of marriage, I walked down Anson Street feeling calm and satisfied with our life. I trusted her, and I know she trusted me. So, after several years of marriage and the same amount of time spent together before that, I walked down Anson Street, confident that our life was arranged. Good morning, Mr. Banyan. Have a good trip. Mr. Shields has been my neighbor since I bought this house. His wife died a couple of years ago, and he found solace in his hobby of growing orchids on the roof of his house. Yes, sir. Calm sea and delicious food on the other side. I waved to him as I turned towards my house. The lock on the iron gate leading to the courtyard along the side of the house had recently broken and needed welding to fix it, but the gate still remained closed. I never came through the front door. It became a habit for me to look around the garden before entering the house. Tammy parks curbside and uses the main entrance as do guests, but my habits die hard. The back door leads to a short hallway connecting the kitchen to the pantry, which gives access to the front rooms and bathroom. I threw my jacket over the back of the kitchen chair and found a flower vase. There was a bakery box with a couple of croissants on the table, and I helped myself to one before moving into the front living room and taking off my shoes. Since it was still a little early for dinner, I didn't expect her to be home, so I went upstairs to change clothes and unpack. Perhaps it was because of my engineering background and love of detail, but I noticed it right away and it caught my attention. The toilet seat was up, and on the shelf in the shower was a body wash I hadn't seen before, a blue gel with a scent more suitable for a man than for Tammy. It was something a man would use. So does a raised toilet seat. This has been a long-standing subject of controversy. In all the years the girls had lived in the house, the seat in the other two bathrooms had never been raised. Tammy once chided me for this, and after a couple of months of living together, she trained me well enough to become sensitive to the needs of the fair sex. So seeing the seat raised in our bathroom after I had been gone for almost 10 weeks was unsettling. It's probably not as bad as catching them in the act. One of my friends once encountered this unpleasant scene and ended up spending a month in jail after making another guy spend his month in a hospital ward. And they weren't even married. No, it was bad enough, although I tried to convince myself that there was probably some damn good explanation for why the seat was up and there was male gel in the bathroom. I couldn't think of one, but perhaps it existed. I finished changing, went downstairs, checked the messages from the flight, and, pretending that nothing had happened, headed to the Henry's House bar for a pint of beer. This is a local spot nearby where people who like to drink and listen to jazz gather. My old friend Satch runs the bar, and I can always count on special treatment and good advice, even if I don't need it. "Look like a cat on a walk, old man," he shouted when I entered. The crowd of partygoers had not yet filled the place, so there were a few regulars sitting here. "When did you return? Didn't you hear my whistle?" "I gave 2 short ones," I answered. He just laughed and said he thought it was a tug honking. Satch got his nickname for his charisma and passion for jazz, which he liked to play in the bar. He also loved his regular visitors, even if they changed over time. I've been going here for several years now, along with a dozen other people. We've lost a couple of friends to dodgy spouses and moved a few more. "Golden IPA from Maximilian," he announced into the microphone. "My name is Maxwell, but I've never been bothered by his pretentious addresses. Hey, by the way, Dave Hoff came by and asked if you were coming back." Dave is one of those regulars we lost due to his cheating wife and moving. But he is a young guy with a strong head. But his ex-wife, Tracy, well, she will still understand what a fool she was to lose such a good man. "He left a letter for you," Satch called from the end of the bar. I opened the letter, enjoying a delicious beer, and was surprised to find an invitation to a wedding on Lake Texoma in distant Oklahoma. My loud laughter could probably be heard on the street. "He's marrying his ex's sister, damn it," I said loudly with fun. The date was in 4 weeks, and I had 6 left, so it fit into the plans quite well. For Dave and all this madness he gets himself into, I raised a toast for a small company. Then he finished his beer and headed home, preparing for his own mess. Tammy didn't come home by 8 p.m., and I never called her to let her know I was back. Instead, I just sat in the chair by the living room window, looked out at the street, and thought that at times like these I would like to have a soft, fluffy cat. We had 2 of them on the ship, even though it was against the rules. Dusk began to cover the sidewalk as her car parked at the curb, a few spots away from the house. I had just finished my 2nd glass of ale since returning home. I had a million questions, twice as many doubts, and not an ounce of faith in any answers, especially when I saw them both approach the path. I was absolutely sure that they were both about to enter their nest, but she stopped, hugged the man, and, after a long kiss, sent him to the Audi across the street, which had a College of Charleston faculty sticker on the windshield. I've met him before. He was the head of the department where she worked, a self-confident man with the mind of a scientist and the disposition of a fool, a good 10 years older than me. I almost laughed to myself. Tammy is a very attractive woman, and if she wanted to take a lover, she could choose any of dozens of suitors, 12 years younger, if not more. Instead, she became infatuated with a toad in human form. This is not because of the position. She already has a permanent contract. She doesn't need money, and I know that in bed I satisfy her. I just shook my head and turned towards the door as the key turned the lock and the bolt clicked, releasing the frame. She walked into the hallway and sighed as if a long day had ended. That's probably how it was. I briefly remembered our first meeting in this very foyer. For me, she was as beautiful as then, until this picture was marred by a stain of ugliness. She headed towards the kitchen, but maybe it was a premonition, or maybe it was an elusive sound that only my imaginary cat heard. She stopped and turned around. It was getting dark, but I saw it in her eyes as her hand went to her mouth. "Oh God, are you home?" she asked, as if the vision before her was just an illusion. That signal during the day. Was it you? I simply nodded and looked out the window. She must have realized that I could see them from where I was sitting. How could she not understand? "Why didn't you call me?" "I thought I'd surprise you by coming back earlier." "Looks like I should have called." She froze for a moment, and then her artistic inclinations came into play. "Max." "Oh no. Thomas, we just had dinner tonight, that's all." She tried to smile, but even years of teaching had not helped her master the deception necessary to convince her husband. "May I assume he was paying for dinner and expecting something more at the door?" "Max, please, it's not like that." She tried, but she should have understood that the curtain fell after their embrace and not before. "What does it feel like, Tammy, to kiss a toad like that?" She tried to resist, but in the end she knew that I understood. We both knew that she had sex with Thomas Pryor, PhD and lover of other men's wives. "I'll go out for a while. You need to pack a few things and find somewhere to stay, perhaps with Thomas. You can give him back his Mountain Breeze body wash, if that's his." "Max, please, maybe we." I just raised my hand. She cried silently as my heart broke into pieces. I knew about it during the day, but now, as we sat together in the dark living room, the pain was unbearable, at least for me. I think it all hit me when I left the house and walked down the street towards the East Bay. I didn't have a specific goal, but after eating nothing all day other than a handful of pretzels and a croissant, I needed something to eat. I found wings and fried mushrooms at a saloon on Market Street. They were served by a waitress who could barely cover her curves. There's always a diverse crowd there, mostly young, but they definitely have the best wings on the peninsula. The waitress gave me space to think about the situation. Thomas Pryor was already married, although that didn't matter. He probably liked Tammy's body more than his own wife, and I was pretty sure of it. They say Mrs. Pryor could wrestle cows at her leisure. I knew it was wrong to think of her that way, but I still chuckled to keep some semblance of lightness and common sense. However, he and/or someone else took my place, and Tammy must have known that this would ruin our relationship. The house was dark when I returned, almost impossibly quiet compared to the cozy atmosphere I was used to feeling when I returned here. Tammy appeared to have packed a few things and left. When I checked the shower gel was no longer there. She may have taken it with her or thrown it away. I didn't care. I felt like a broken man, and taking off my shirt and throwing it over the headboard, I fell into a restless sleep. When dawn came, I broke my habit and skipped breakfast, instead taking my bike and heading to the battery at the tip of the peninsula. I needed to let off some steam and find a place to think, and sitting on a stone radiator overlooking the harbor made it easy to do both. The problem with rumination is that you can think too much and end up questioning everything you thought was right. Of course, imaginary images popped up in my head. Did she serve him with the same passion with which I knew she was doing it for me? Thoughts about what happened between them haunted me. She enjoyed certain moments of intimacy, and these memories kept me stuck over and over again. Questions about how they spent time together only increased the pain inside. And then really important thoughts came that turned everything upside down. I didn't want this marriage to end. I invested too much into it, both time and heart, for everything to collapse like that. Was Pryor the first lover, or had there been other men over the years who had desecrated my bed? This was the problem of thinking in a state of emptiness or despair. Both lead to an almost Faustian bargain to return everything to the way it was, to almost sell his soul for the opportunity to return the past, But that's the problem. I no longer knew for sure what that past was. One thing was clear. I would need to sit down and talk to Tammy, putting the dark clouds of destruction aside, at least for a while. Her boss had sex with her in my bed while I was at sea, and she didn't seem to see a problem with it. This was the main barrier that needed to be overcome if it was at all possible, and I didn't know if it was possible. I later learned that Tammy had gone to stay with her sister, the same one who rented a room from me when we first met. Tammy kept her bungalow, and when her sister's marriage broke down, she allowed her to move in after the previous tenant's lease ended. Whether Pryor met her there or not, I did not know. This was to be found out when we talked. The rain pattered lightly on the kitchen window overlooking the back garden, keeping the two of us confined to what was now more a lonely home than a cozy hearth. She looked good, but also haggard, if that was even possible. Maybe it was my fantasy or desire, I don't know. Max, this is not what I wanted. Please believe me. What did you want, Tammy? I asked, trying to understand her thoughts. She didn't know how to answer this question. Damn, I couldn't blame her for that. I wouldn't even know how to answer if I were in her place. Is Pryor what you wanted? She just laughed bitterly, her face a mixture of conflicting emotions. Lord, no. We can hardly work together now. It was a stupid damn mistake, Max. A mistake for which there is no excuse. But you still slept with him this week? I was testing the waters, but she didn't know about it. No, Max. I completely broke up with him the same night I left here. I called him from the bungalow. He didn't want to agree, but when I threatened to tell Sophie, he shut up. I pictured Sophie Pryor, all 200 pounds of her, sweeping Thomas off his feet, breaking the glasses on his nose, and I smiled faintly. Out of all the available male population, Tammy, why the hell did you choose this bastard? I don't understand. I don't know, I really don't know, she answered. The only thing I can say is, he constantly put pressure on me, reminding me how much I owed him, how he helped me with the position. He constantly supported me, was by my side, told me how wonderful I was, and reminded me how lonely I was. Over time, it became a habit. First dinner, then drinks, he began to take me to his favorite places. It became comfortable. One evening, he got me drunk, took me home, and we slept together. He didn't take advantage of me, didn't force me. I did it voluntarily, although if I hadn't been drunk the first time, this would never have happened. Nevertheless, it happened. We slept together for about a month before you returned. Here's the millionth question, Tammy. You know what it is. People are talking. How many of them were there before this freak? If I thought she would start fussing over trying to answer, I was wrong. 3. There were 3 before Thomas. I wanted to be surprised, but I wasn't, although at the same time it came as a surprise. They were all before we got married, Max, before I moved in with you, and you don't know them. None of them live here anymore. They were students. This really surprised me, but before I could say anything, she continued. It was hard for me to cope with your long absences, Max. It was very difficult, but I loved you and didn't show it. At the time, I just thought that you were probably doing the same thing somewhere far away and would never know about it. That was years ago, and honestly, I can't lie. It was just physical, and it really helped relieve the stress, maybe once a month while you were gone. No romance or relationships, just sex, and that's it. Maybe it's because I was a woman living alone, with a man who was away so often. But when I moved in with you, I stopped everything until this last trip. Now I've ruined everything, haven't I? I believed her, and what happened a long time ago, and before she moved in with me, was not a problem for me, although her dishonesty still hurts. I've never done this before. Tammy, it's what's happening right now that worries me. Pryor has made himself at home in my damn bed, and I'm going to need some time to sort this out, if I can at all. And if I can't, I don't know. She started crying, and I handed her a napkin. After a long pause, she continued. I know. That's why I decided to do something I didn't want to do. I'm about to accept a 6-month fellowship at a university in Vancouver. This will allow me to leave Pryor and still keep my place and position in Charleston. They will send someone else instead of me. You decided that quickly. You made this decision before our conversation. I didn't talk about this before because I wasn't going to agree, but everything has changed, hasn't it? Yes, unfortunately. You know that I am coming to the end of 30 years of experience, and I also need to make decisions. This, of course, complicates everything. She didn't say anything, but I read the painful agreement on her face. Oh yes, and I should have told you earlier. Dave Hoff is getting married again next month, and I plan to go. He marries Tracy's sister, Tora. I never would have thought. If you're here, I can put our problems aside if you want to go. I suggested it to give her a chance, but I didn't care. It's a pity that I didn't know. By then, I'll be in Vancouver. Maybe it's for the best, Max. We left it at that, exchanged a painful hug, and she drove back to West Ashley. Dave was an old buddy of mine from Henry's house, but it seems drinking buddies' antics don't always translate into family-level friendships. And yet, perhaps she was right. Tammy flew to Vancouver a week after we spoke. We had dinner together the night before, but nothing had changed. We unofficially separated to give each other the space we needed. I didn't make any demands, and she didn't offer anything. I think it was the last point that was most troubling. We both enjoyed a rich sex life when we were together. Our professional separations, sometimes as long as 10 weeks, always seemed to fuel the fire of passion when we were reunited. We spent weekends in complete solitude, going out only for food and drinks so that we could return to the uncontrollable passion. Could I do without this for 6 months? Of course I could, but would I want to, knowing that my estranged wife was off on her new cosmopolitan adventure? I think a lot would depend on the decisions we make in the coming weeks and months. We will either die as a couple, or we will find a way to return to each other. I flew into Dallas-Fort Worth the night before and waited until the morning to go to what I jokingly called Dave's Judgment Stage to congratulate an old friend. The drive along Highway 75 was easy, and after crossing the Red River into Oklahoma, I was able to cross another state off my bucket list. Max, come here. I want to introduce you to good people. Dave smiled widely, standing next to his new wife. I followed them to a group of people gathered at the pier. I have already officially met most of them at the wedding. So this is the captain. The young woman asked curiously. Max, this is Winona Gustafson. Dave introduced me to his new and old relatives, a charming woman named Susan, whom I had already met in Charleston, and, surprisingly, his ex-wife Tracy, who was there with her new boyfriend. I thought it would be awkward, but apparently they hit it off. Somehow it so happened that I spent the evening in the company of Winona, although I perfectly understood that I was several years older than her. It didn't matter. She taught me how to dance 2 steps, and by the end of the evening we had a lot of fun. I would like to say that I slept with this cunning vixen, but I behaved like a real gentleman, and we parted as just pleasant conversationalists. It seemed to me that she would like to add a sea captain to her list of conquests, but Tammy was on my mind. It would be wrong. Still, it was a strong temptation if that was what it was. The happy couple headed off on their honeymoon, and I headed south into the Texas hills, and then to San Antonio for a few days. I was in this city many years ago, but never had the opportunity to return. One of my friends arranged for me to stay for 3 days at the Menger Hotel near the Alamo downtown. This was what I had hoped for, traveling around the country with Tammy, visiting places like this when I retired. I sat in the old bar of the Menger Hotel, listening to stories about Teddy Roosevelt, who is said to have driven his horse right up to the bar, and hundreds of other stories about the Texas Rangers that the bartender has probably told 1,000 times. At the end of the evening, I went up to my room to repeat it all the next day. A week later, I was preparing for the next port, burdened with thoughts of an unstable marriage and decisions that I could not make. Almost 6 months later, the journey to the east took 14 days as we approached the lights of the harbor cranes along the pier at Bremerhaven. With mostly calm seas, the voyage was uneventful, except for one stop at sea for a quick repair to the rear of the main shaft. Molly Sane had to stay in port for 6 days. We were waiting on the third installment of the parts order from Borg Warner before we could move on. These 3 extra days allowed most of the crew to take leave and spend time ashore doing what they were used to. There was no need to guess. Most of them would drown in mugs of beer and find solace in the company of port beauties. Some of them might have to see a doctor in the middle of the next flight, but that was up to them. "Captain Banyan, would you like to join me for dinner this evening?" A tall, elegant man turned to me as soon as we completed customs control. Denny's Toller wore several hats, the main one being the role of Director of Port Operations in Bremerhaven. When the most powerful man in the port invites you to dinner, you shouldn't refuse. We went to the Suit Deern restaurant with his daughter, a dark-eyed beauty in her 40s named Kirsten. "Max, do you ever take passengers on your crossings?" she asked. "Last summer, 2 students crossed the ocean with us from New York to Southampton. They thought it would be a great adventure, but I suspect they got bored after a couple of days. We don't have fancy cabins or nightly entertainment, unless you count poker games among the crew as such." The sparkle in her eyes showed her adventurous spirit, and I realized that she would find something to do even in such conditions. "I used to often fly to New York with my ex-husband," she recalled, "and looking down, I always tried to see the ships, but they were too small at such a height. I've always dreamed of a trip like this, just for the adventure." On board the ship, she would certainly have caused quite a stir among the crew. Her ample chest, which rose and fell beautifully with each breath, could have been an unnecessary distraction for 15 sailors on the high seas, but she certainly seemed like a woman who could handle such attention. "Well, Miss Kirsten, if you ever want to spend 12 days or more crossing the cold Atlantic Ocean, let us know and we'll book you a cabin. I think we have a few boxes taking up space, but if you give it a little time, we'll make it cozy." I couldn't help but laugh. Director Toller just laughed and warned me that I might have given an invitation that I would later regret. Molly Sane was fueled, the bulkheads were secured, and when the harbor master took us out of the harbor, there were 6,250 containers on board, both in the hold and on deck. My engineer started the propeller, and we set off for the North Sea. As we left port, a winter storm was approaching from the northeast coast of the United States, moving northeast toward Iceland. The head office gave us permission to continue our journey. However, by the time we approached the English Channel off Guernsey, the storm had changed course and was directly on our northern route across the ocean. A front formed over Greenland and was moving south, making the storm's easterly shift difficult to predict. Head office made the decision for us. We will dock at Portsmouth and sail as soon as conditions improve. Roger Chaffee sat opposite me as the waitress brought a fresh ale and a couple of whiskeys to our table. I first met him when I was first officer, and he was first officer on the Morris container ship from Southampton in 2002. His first wife had left him a couple of years earlier, and he became a real heartthrob. I will never forget the surprise on his face when I refused his invitation to take part in the pleasures of 2 American students who were spending the summer in England. Both girls were clearly ready for a night of debauchery and chose us for the experience. I showed him my ring, and he just grinned, squeezing the girl's ample breasts in his lap. "Damn it, buddy, are you sure?" he asked. I was sure that the image of Tammy left me no chance of any carnal pleasure from this adventure. It didn't matter. Roger disappeared with both girls, one on each arm, and I didn't see him until the next afternoon. The smile never left his face right up to the pier. "So, she's gone for good?" he asked. I told him the story of the return and my discoveries during Tammy's last 6 months in Vancouver. I may have kept silent about the pain, or most of it, but any attentive person could see it etched on my face. "I don't know, Roger. We usually talk once a week for a few minutes. We agreed on this from the beginning, but since I haven't seen her since she left, I really don't know." "Do you want her back?" "Well, that's the main question." As we sat at the kitchen table on Anson Street, my immediate answer would be yes. Of course I want her back. And now I want it, but at what cost? She had 6 months to experience as many love affairs as she wished, if any at all. The same applies to me, although I was not with anyone. I didn't know if she was with someone. Then it seemed to me that there wasn't. What do I know now? This is a difficult question, buddy. Ask me about it when she gets back to Charleston, if she does. We sat for a while longer, enjoying the beer and the small crowd around us. A couple of middle-aged women chatted with us, and perhaps we could pursue this goal, but the weight of the past we both carried dampened this desire. Roger was seriously dating a woman and seemed to have calmed down, leaving his energy for the woman he intended to make his wife. She was a strong Englishwoman from the north, beautiful in her own way, and if a sailor can define love, she was that to him. As for me, I only had my hand and a vivid imagination, although I must admit that temptations were always there. I just held back until I thought there was a chance for Tammy and I to reconcile. The next morning, when I relieved the second officer on watch, heavy rain was washing the bridge. The storm actually moved further east, and the wind increased in the strait. By mid-morning, the cranes had stopped operating, and almost all activity on the pier had ceased. "We accept the passenger at the rate, sir," the steward reported to me when the crew finished strengthening the additional fastenings. "She will board as soon as the storm passes and we get permission to leave." This news came at the wrong time. I was sure that the kitchen was not prepared for a passenger and we would have to clear out the extra cabin. "Did you say she? Where did she come from?" I asked, remembering our recent dinner. "From Exeter, sir." The steward began making arrangements for the passenger, and I continued my duties until the storm passed several hours later. By evening, we were put in line to leave, hoping that it would happen early in the morning. "Our passenger, Miss Seaver, has boarded, sir." The first mate escorted her to the cabin. "Should we have a captain's dinner at 9 p.m., sir?" Traditionally, when we have a passenger, paying or not, we arrange a meeting shortly after boarding, and before boarding to go over a few rules and expectations, as well as provide a safety briefing. A container ship is a dangerous place, and the safety of everyone on board is always a priority. "Yes, please. Set it up in the meeting room next to my cabin. Have both assistants present." Following tradition, I changed into a dress uniform, carefully put on the captain's cap, and opened the door to the briefing room. "Captain Max, what an amazing impression you make," she exclaimed with an energetic smile, her ample breasts heaving on her chest with this exclamation. "Miss Seaver?" I asked, momentarily taken by surprise. "My ex-husband's name is actually Toller Sewer. I never changed my last name after the divorce." Kirsten Toller Sewer had clearly already charmed my two officers. Even before I arrived, both could barely hide their smiles. They completed the safety briefing and familiarized her with the areas of the ship that were strictly prohibited from entering. Now it is my turn, as the captain of the ship, to fulfill my duties. "So, Kirsten, how did you decide to go on this journey? We are quite far from Bremerhaven." "Oh, this is just an amazing story, Max. I told my dad that I was serious about setting sail, and when I decided to do it immediately, you had already left the port. Then I heard about the storm, and Dad said that you had to go to this port. The only airport I could fly to was Exeter, and here I am. I called him after I left, so he couldn't stop me. Of course, your head office didn't want to let me in at first, but I said I could get there 12 hours before departure. They agreed, especially after I mentioned Dad for good measure. I cleared my throat to hide my awkwardness and cast a disapproving glance at my officers. They seemed to find her spontaneity quite amusing. "I'm sure, madam, it was not easy for you to get there, given the storm. I hope our terms suit you. If I had known about your arrival, I would." "Oh no, Max, everything is fine as it is. I wouldn't want to change anything, honestly." It was hard to argue with her smile, even if I wanted to. We chatted a little more on the bridge, after which I excused myself and allowed her to return to her quarters. "Captain, I'm sure the crew will be pleased," said my first mate with a smile from ear to ear. "Without a doubt," I thought as I climbed the steps to the captain's bridge. Roger Chaffee led us out of the port a few hours later. As was his old habit, he winked when he saw Miss Kirsten on the observation deck. Women's beauty always attracted his attention. "Another time, old man," he said, and went to the boat on the starboard side. The Molly Sane team consisted of 9 people, all of them from Portugal. These sailors had already worked on the ship for several passages. Although 2 of them were new, they came to replace those who changed the ship or took up other matters. Although old stories about sailors from distant lands are often exaggerated, most container ship crew members come from the same country. Common language and customs make sailing together much easier. A couple of senior Portuguese sailors commanded the crew with a firm hand. Although this was rarely necessary, they left most of their worries on shore. And with 12-hour shifts alternating every 10 weeks, there was simply no time left for pranks. However, with Miss Kirsten on board, I asked my assistants to be especially careful. "Max, this is just incredibly beautiful. Is it always like this here?" Miss Kirsten asked a couple of evenings later, standing with me on the observation deck. "The only light for miles is up there unless the deck lights are on." A crescent moon hung in the sky, and millions of stars against the backdrop of a black horizon created the atmosphere of our journey. Her hand lightly touched my back, and Lord, I felt myself get hard. And not so, but strong, like a 20-year-old cadet on his first voyage from the Maine Maritime Academy. Fortunately, or vice versa, I was called by radio to the bridge to resolve an urgent issue. I apologized, almost feeling her longing gaze sliding down my neck. Later that night, I let my lustful thoughts carry me away to a few pleasant moments in my cabin. Yes, I masturbated, imagining how beautiful she would be, naked and aroused under me in the bunk. My headquarters always took meals in the officers' mess, designed for 6. Since 2 watches are always occupied, there were usually 4 of us. Our passenger Kirsten was given a seat at the buffet next to the captain's. This allowed her to be close to me at every meal and generally be the center of attention. None of us seemed to mind. My second mate clearly fell in love with her at first sight. The chief mate even started making fun of him, calling him second puppy when he thought I wasn't listening. It was all a joke among my comrades, so I didn't say anything. A few nights later, under the same starry sky, Miss Kirsten and I were back on the observation deck, enjoying conversation about life. "Max, you and your wife didn't have children?" she asked, looking into the black waves ahead of us. "No, we both chose the life of adventurers. Mine here, hers in the academic world. In addition, she could not have children, and we would consider adoption unfair to the child, given my frequent absences and her career plans. What about you? Are there little Kirstens out there somewhere?" She was silent for a moment and then took my arm. "Oh yes, I have a daughter. She is now an adult, or at least considers herself one. She is 20 and studies at the university in Wuisburg. A very independent girl, studying physics and a whole bunch of things that I don't understand. Her name is Marlene, after her great-grandmother, Dad's mom." We stood in silence while she smiled, remembering her daughter. "Max, do you mind?" she asked, taking a small flask from her pocket. "Of course not," I replied. Passengers were allowed to carry alcohol if it was for personal use and in small quantities. I kept a small bottle of cognac in my cabin for special occasions, although officially it didn't exist. She took a small sip and offered it to me, but I refused. "Debt and all that," I explained. Our evening came to an end, and I returned to the bridge to complete my reports before heading to bed. I returned to my cabin around 11 p.m., read a little, and set my alarm for 5 a.m. and fell asleep. People say that as you age, it becomes more difficult to sleep without waking up. I've never had such a problem. Once I go to bed, I don't move for 5 to 6 hours unless my alarm wakes me up. It rang at 2:34 a.m. with a sharp, piercing sound similar to a dying cry. But it wasn't my alarm clock. It was the voice of a man screaming in pain. When I jumped up and grabbed my coat, the officer on duty was already running past my cabin along the narrow corridor. There was noise on the street. The door to Miss Kirsten's cabin was open. When I approached, there was a man lying on the floor, his trousers pulled down to expose him, and the duty officer was holding him by the shoulder. My God, what's going on here?" I yelled in the midst of chaos. The sailor on the floor was bleeding from his groin area. Kirsten stood nearby, holding a long knitting needle in her hands, her nightgown torn and barely covering her with any hint of modesty. I took her robe off the hook and handed it to her. I woke up when he climbed into my bed, and I panicked. My bag of knitting was on the table nearby, and I grabbed what was at hand, she said through tears, trembling as the shock began to subside. I put my arm around her shoulders and helped her to my cabin. Kirsten, please make yourself comfortable here while I figure this all out. I gave her a box of tissues and pointed to the small refrigerator if she wanted something to drink. When I returned, my employees and both Portuguese petty officers were already there. There was a large stain on the bed, and the offender was treated by our first mate, who also served as a medic. Having sorted it out, we realized what happened. This Portuguese sailor worked on the upper deck, securing the rigging during the voyage. He built a homemade tool to break into Kirsten's cabin. The locks in the rooms were sliding and could be opened using something like a master key. Crew are prohibited from being above the third barrier on deck in the bridge area unless called on business. This intruder climbed over the barriers to the cabins and got inside. He probably regretted his action. After he was neutralized and then sent into the hold, he received serious injuries requiring medical attention. Before arriving at the port, he was given only basic first aid, including bandages and pain medication. In the hold, he was provided with minimal conditions water, beans, and pita bread became his only food for this time. The doctor examined Kirsten for injuries, released her, and by breakfast, none of us could sleep. I have instructed the engineer to issue padlocks to the cabins until we can fix the locking mechanisms. What will happen to that scoundrel that night? She asked a few evenings later when we were talking on the observation bridge. That was a good question. Molly Sane was under the jurisdiction of Panamanian maritime law in international waters, and the offender was subject to extradition as soon as we docked. However, I knew from past experiences that it is more difficult than it seems. Miss Kirsten will be required to testify along with my staff and myself, after which they will be transferred to the Panamanian consulate in Tampa. Panama will probably demand his deportation to Portugal. I'd like to just throw him overboard. I tried to defuse the situation. I think he will be deported to his homeland. It will lose the right to enter us and European ports. How are you feeling? She squeezed my hand and smiled. I'm fine now, although the first couple of nights I was worried, especially after the adrenaline subsided. My dad taught my sister and I how to protect ourselves when we were kids, and this isn't the first time for me. I broke a guy's arm at university, although this one was bigger. But seriously, I'm fine. What about his wounds? There was a serious injury on board, which the ship's doctor did everything possible to deal with. The damage was extensive, and recovery promised to be difficult. The bleeding was stopped, and the wounds were carefully treated and bandaged. However, there were still 4 days left before arriving at the port, during which the victim could only count on changing the bandages and some fresh air. In addition, the atmosphere on board was far from sympathetic. No one, including his compatriots, showed good feelings towards him. The next 4 days passed quietly, although I spent most of my free time in the company of Kirsten. When we entered the shipping channel in front of Charleston Harbor, she knew everything about me except some intimate preferences, something better not to discuss with a lady. We entered the harbor, past the battery, where we were met by a pilot with 2 tugs to take us to the terminal Welch Pants on the Mount Pleasant side of the river. 2 short and 1 long beeps as you pass by East Bay. Let Satch know that I was ready to leave the sea life. I didn't call Tammy, so I had no idea if she was home or heard the signal. After clearing customs and completing depositions, DHS boarded the ship, took the crew member from the hold into custody, and I handed the helm over to my engineer before departing. Captain, come on, my wife and I will give you a lift to the city center, my first mate suggested, having already loaded Kirsten's suitcases onto the cart and heading to his wife's car. Kirsten stayed at the Spectator Hotel on State Street, just south of Market Square, for a few days before heading to Washington and then New York. She was going to fly home from there. When we dropped her off, the porter busied himself with her luggage, and she hugged me tightly, reminding me of the excitement I had felt on deck a few evenings earlier. "Max, when you sort out your business, remember, you promised to show me the city properly," she recalled with a quick kiss. After that, I asked to be dropped off at home. No white roses this time. Everything looked almost the same as 10 weeks ago. I lifted the latch on the iron gate, reproaching myself for never fixing the weld, and slowly walked across the yard to the back door. When I entered the house, it was as quiet as the day I set sail. There were only small signs of the occupants who had moved in before I left, but otherwise nothing had changed. When Tammy left for Vancouver, I decided to rent out another room to a second student, who was a family friend of the girl who was already living with us. They both turned out to be quiet, studious people who kept to themselves and were extremely careful. Sometimes I didn't even know if they were even home. One of the girls left a couple of notes next to the phone. As I looked through them and the stack of mostly promotional mail, I noticed several business letters that Tammy had forwarded to me. Among them was a letter from Mrs. Sophie Pryor. "Mr. Banyong, please call me as soon as you return to town. Sincerely, Miss Pryor." I set the note aside, left the laundry in the laundry room, and went upstairs to shower and change in preparation for a quick dinner at Henry's with a couple of pints of beer. "I heard your rusty vessel come back, Max," Satch called me, passing me a cold IPA. "The last time we chatted, you were thinking about moving into a nursing home." I turned 52 a few months ago, and Satch took every opportunity to remind me of it, although he was only a year younger. However, it didn't matter. Another year on the other side of the grass for me. I was as healthy as a horse, still full of energy, just a little gray at the temples and with a full set of teeth. "I'm thinking of opening a hostel for female students, 3 to a room," I said jokingly. Considering that there were now 2 students already living in my house, Satch just shook his head, grinning. One of the students sitting at the next table heard our conversation and came over, asking if I was serious when I said this. She was looking for housing for the start of the summer semester. I gave her my business card with the numbers of 2 current residents, telling her to contact them. They were in charge of all new occupancies. Satch just looked at me, and we both burst out laughing. Not bad for an old man about to retire. A couple of days later, I remembered a note from Sophie Pryor and decided to call her. "Max, thank you for calling back. I know you're busy, and with everything going on, I wasn't sure you'd want to talk," Sophie answered on the second ring. "Sophie, I always have time for you. Can we assume that this is connected with your husband and my wife?" I immediately got to the point. "I guess so. Thomas has been running around for a long time. I just didn't expect Tammy to fall for him. I wanted to contact you earlier, but every time I came to the battery, you went back to sea. This time I left a note with a nice girl who was renting a room from you. She's so sweet." "Yes, both of them are beautiful girls." "Well, yes, of course. As for Thomas, I kicked him out of the house in Charleston after decorating him with a black eye to match his black travel bag," she laughed. "He now lives in our condominium on King Street, although he seems to spend as much time in Vancouver as he does here. The secretary says it's academic conferences. Bullshit, I say. I thought you should know that Tammy has been in Vancouver for 6 months, according to her staff. I really don't understand what she could see in him. But Max, a month ago, she called me. She apologized for 10 minutes through a stream of tears and asked to convince Thomas to leave her alone, since he was literally stalking her. I realized that she had driven him away more than once when he tried to stay with her. Yes, she lived with Jim Dolberg for several months, but at least she came to her senses and drove Thomas away. On my side, I dealt with him. As soon as she said this, my heart sank. I blamed myself for not realizing this sooner. Jim Dolberg is a professor of humanities at Kingston University in Ontario with ties to Vancouver. We had dinner together several times and even invited him to our home. Tammy's connection with Dolberg was much more likely than with that toad like Thomas. Maybe it was the long, tense pause that made Sophie think. "Max, didn't you know about Jim?" "No, Sophie, this is news to me." "Oh my God, I thought everyone already knew this since Tammy left for Vancouver. Do you know how long this has been going on? Max, I'm not sure. You know, people say different things. I've heard rumors since last year. All I know is that it was going on when she called me, or at least she lived in the same apartment. I checked with the university to find both her and Jim's contact information, and they are listed as the same address. Sophie, thank you for telling me this. Seriously, this is very important to me, especially now, with everything else going on. I promised Sophie I would stay in touch and ended the call. Sophie, you're a cunning old lady, set her up like this, I muttered under my breath. Besides the revelation about Tammy and Dolberg, I also found out that Thomas Pryor was actually a kept man. He did not own any of the assets he and Sophie enjoyed, and had no right to her wealth or property, since she had inherited most of it before their marriage. They lived on Battery Row, the most prestigious address in the city. She also owned an apartment on King Street, and said she decided to remove his things and change the locks in his absence. Poor frog. 6 months of separation had just been finally confirmed, and although I should have been seething with anger at the revelation, I took it surprisingly calmly. Sure, I was mad as hell about being deceived, but it didn't seem weird anymore. From a cheater's point of view, this made perfect sense, given that Jim Dolberg was an easy target for any serious groupie. Thomas was just a damn toad. There's no other way to describe him, and I still couldn't understand it. There must have been more to this story. Anyway, I looked at the ring on my finger, and after a moment's thought, took it off and put it in the candy bowl on the mantelpiece. Well, hello, my sea captain, she said when I answered the call. I hadn't thought much about Kirsten since my partner, and I dropped her off at the Spectator when we arrived at the port. But as soon as she heard the sound of her voice, images of her full breasts, barely covered by the soft wool sweater she had worn to dinner a couple of evenings ago, appeared before my eyes. Good afternoon, Miss Kirsten. Max, how is your home situation after returning? Everything is about the same. I live alone again, I answered without going into details. She was silent for a moment and then asked directly, I need a companion for dinner tonight, Max. I hope you will be kind and keep me company. I made a reservation for 2 at the Oak. He came highly recommended. And then maybe we'll take a walk down the street because the evening is so wonderful. It's much nicer than snowy Bremerhaven. She confidently cast the bait, and I was hooked. Meet me in the lobby downstairs at 7 p.m. I don't know if I agreed, but when we finished talking, I was already looking in the closet for my favorite tweed jacket and heading to the shower. If Tammy crossed my mind, her image was overshadowed by thoughts of Jim Dolberg, having sex with her every night in distant Vancouver. I may not have thought as clearly as I should have, but the temptation, even if not fully experienced, was tempting enough for dinner and a walk. I got ready and went to Anson Street, almost skipping. By 6:55, I found myself at the Spectator's bar, swirling a glass of bourbon and waiting for Miss Toller-Siver. When I looked up, she was standing there literally gorgeous. Her low-cut, midnight-colored dress was bursting with milky white breasts, the hem just above the knee, dark red lipstick, and smoky eye makeup. My fingers wanted to adjust the tension in my pants, but I restrained myself. Jesus, I whispered, trying not to let her hear. She just smiled and greeted me in a European way, touching her wet lips to each cheek. Miss Kirsten, you look stunning, as always. Captain Banyan, you are a man of wonderful words. What woman gets tired of being called stunning? After finishing her bourbon, Kirsten threw a cape over her shoulders, and we caught a rickshaw at the entrance to take us to Broad Street and the Oak Restaurant. We were greeted by the head waiter and shown to our table in a cozy corner on the second floor. What about Mrs.? She asked over dessert. I did not tell her anything about my recent discoveries, but there was such a degree of trust between us that I was able to say that the current state of affairs hardly leaves room for reconciliation. No hope? She asked with a serious expression on her face. I don't see how this is possible. There seemed to be a spark in her eyes. Is that why you don't wear a ring? I had completely forgotten about him, but she was right. Tammy and I were a done deal. Let me pay and let's take a walk around the city, I suggested. We walked outside onto Broad Street, and Kirsten took off her heels and pulled on a pair of canvas moccasins before taking my arm. We slowly walked through the labyrinth of antique shops and galleries. It was a cool evening in early March, comfortable enough for her cape and my tweed jacket. About an hour later, I caught another bike taxi, and we were quickly taken to Henry's house for a new cocktail. To be honest, I wanted to show off to Satch a little by showing up with Kirsten on my arm, just to annoy him. As usual for me, brother, and white wine for my date, I told him with a grin at the bar. It was a weeknight, so there weren't as many meat market-type regulars as there were on the weekend. It's good to see that Max has finally realized that he needs a chaperone, Satch replied with a smile, quietly moving his lips, Tammy, so that Kirsten wouldn't see. I shook my head slightly. Kirsten smiled and hugged my arm tighter, which amused Satch even more. She was like honey to the bees. A handful of regulars took turns approaching to appraise the booty. It was wrong to bring her to Henry's house, but at that moment I didn't care. We had a good time, and it was my place of power. We drank perhaps a little more than we should have, and our internal barriers had dropped to the level of sale in stock. The two excited adults continued to exchange passionate glances. I glanced at my empty ring a couple of times, thinking, but the memory of Jim Dolberg put any doubts to rest. To me? I asked. Yes. Please, let's go, she quickly replied. The house greeted us with silence as I turned the latch, and we entered the living room. 2 students lived on the 3rd floor, and I rarely saw them in the evenings, which was probably for the best since I didn't mention them to Kirsten. My mind was completely consumed by passion. Max, she whispered, I want you. She glanced up the stairs and let one strap of her dress slide down to her elbow, returning her seductive gaze to my eyes. With a gentle tug on the remaining strap, the blue dress fell to her waist and then to her ankles. She stepped out of it, leaving it on the floor, standing in front of me in a lacy beige slip that barely contained her beautiful breasts, and smiled an almost devilish smile. Turning, she slowly walked up the stairs, moving her full, firm hips gracefully, as if on purpose for maximum effect. I followed her, not taking my eyes off her seductive forms, realizing what pleasures awaited me ahead. Straight ahead, I muttered, barely audible, as she reached the landing and removed the combination, leaving it at the foot of the stairs to the 3rd floor. She stood almost completely naked, wearing only French-cut lace panties, hiding what many men before me were probably chasing. Her chest heaved in anticipation of the pleasures that awaited us beyond the threshold. Treason, Dolberg, deception, Dolberg, Tammy, bitch. My mind was working on overdrive in a matter of seconds as I lifted Kirsten into my arms and carried her across the threshold of the bedroom, her lips hungrily pressed against my throat. I laid her on the bed and hastily began to take off my clothes without taking my eyes off her eyes. As we left Henry's house, I took one little blue pill, a favorite choice for middle-aged men, and she was left in no doubt of my intentions as I climbed onto the bed with obvious determination. Do it, Max, she whispered, breathless, as my hands found the waistband of her robe and I gently helped her take it off. I started by letting my touch do the talking, paying attention to her every movement, every breath. Everything was slow and deliberate, filled with a desire to give her joy and pleasure. She responded to my actions with equal enthusiasm, allowing the moment to carry us both beyond the everyday. This was the first woman besides Tammy I'd had in over 20 years. Over the years, I had gotten used to a certain routine, but with Kirsten, it was different. She took the initiative, showing with her energy and warmth that she was ready to trust me completely. Her gaze and gestures spoke more than any words could, turning our moment of intimacy into something surprising and new. She leaned over me, touching my back with her hands, completely controlling my face. We felt each other on an emotional level, connecting in a moment full of trust and intimacy. I saw her eyes sparkle and knew that she was enjoying every second. She sat down next to me, took a breath, and, smiling, said, "You know how to surprise." A few moments later, she was next to me again, touching me with tenderness and teasing me with a playful look. She leaned closer, touching my cheek, and quietly whispered, "You are my best gift." Moments of mutual pleasure and intimacy turned into quiet conversation. We looked at each other, smiled, and enjoyed the feeling of complete harmony. We soon found ourselves in her arms as she clung trustingly to me. Her touch was gentle and her words were sincere. She laid her head on my chest and I hugged her, feeling her slowly relax. "You're incredible, Kirsten," I whispered in her ear. She just smiled back, touching my hair and lightly pulling it with her fingers. Between the conversations, laughter, and warmth of the night, we fell asleep in absolute peace and quiet, not worrying about time or things to do. When I first moved, it was already close to noon, and Kirsten was already up. I didn't hear her when I went to shower, and when I returned to the bedroom, she was still gone. I put on my work pants and a t-shirt and went down to the kitchen. "Good morning, Captain Max," Kirsten said with a beaming smile, sitting at the table with my two students who lived upstairs. Sly, conspiratorial smiles appeared on their faces as they buttered their muffins. "The girls and I were just having a nice chat after they kindly brought my, things this morning," she said, nodding towards her clothes, which were lying on an empty chair. "How nice of them," I replied, trying to contain my smile as I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. The girls excused themselves, giggling, and left, leaving Kirsten with a mock-arrogant look on her face. "Well, I just forgot to tell you that I'm renting out the top floor of the house," she said, making one of those expressions women show when a man realizes he's screwed up, but not too badly. "It's okay, they're nice girls. It seems like one of them is really into you, Max. Try not to break her heart too much," she added with a smile. We had breakfast and then cleaned up, and I showed her the market. By lunchtime, we found a seat at an outdoor cafe. "Max, what are you going to do with your wife? I know you said it was over, but does she know that?" It was a fair question, and one that I haven't yet finalized. There was Tammy, of course, and then Thomas and Sophie, and that white mandingo Jim Dolberg. She lied to me when she had the opportunity to tell the whole truth and put it all behind her. I don't see a way back, especially now, and it's not about what we did, Kirsten. It's about what she did and what she continues to do. "So she didn't break up with him?" "Apparently no," I said, looking at the street with a crowd of passers-by. Even then, I knew that if Tammy had told her everything that rainy day in the kitchen and asked for forgiveness, I would have forgiven her, even leaving the Dolberg story in the past. I loved her so much. I would never have ended up in bed with Kirsten or even entertained such thoughts. But now it was just a past pain. I knew what I needed to do. Kirsten was going to Washington the next day and then to New York for a couple of weeks. The attraction between us was electric, and I almost threw everything away to go with her. But I knew there were unpleasant matters that needed to be sorted out. We ended the day with a water taxi ride around the harbor and river, and then I walked her to her hotel. "Are you sure you don't want to get up, Max?" We discussed what I needed to do, so I declined the offer, but not before we shared a long hug and whispered promises to each other. With that, I headed back to the market and the office on King Street. It was cloudy and drizzling when I arrived and picked up my luggage. The shuttle bus took me to the hotel, and after I settled in, I soon found myself at the bar, stirring bourbon with my finger while I watched some CBC reporter talk about some indigenous issue I knew nothing about. The nice waitress came over and offered to refill my glass, but I had work to do, so I politely declined. "West 10th, near the university, please," I said to the driver when he picked me up. I checked the GPS on her phone and knew she was there, at least electronically. The classic envelope sat in my lap as the driver made his way through the busy streets, avoiding a couple of pedestrians along the way. We stopped in front of a 4-story converted apartment building, and I looked up at the top floor, the far left window, wondering if the god of hellfire had made my path difficult enough. I almost said to myself, screw it, and almost threw the envelope in the mailbox down the street just to go home. "Do you want me to wait, sir?" The driver asked politely, as if reading my thoughts. "No, go ahead. I don't know how long it will take." After I paid, He gave me his business card in case I needed to call him. I walked up the stairs to the top and stood in front of a neat entrance at the end of the hallway, where a couple of flower pots stood guard at the door. On the frame of the door frame was the number 404 in gold letters in the Old English style. I was still wearing leather gloves when I knocked on the door, and then again. "Damn it, Pryor, you fucking bitch!" I heard a man scream as I heard him approach the door. The door opened, and he, opening his eyes wide in surprise, saw me standing there. Max, I thought. 30 years of working as an engineer, installing ladders, laying planks, laying pipes, and repairing engines did not make me a soft person, even at 52 years of age. The blow from his left hand hit him square in the jaw, just below the ear, and Jim Dolberg fell to the floor of the apartment lobby. I stood over him and pissed on his face. When I finished, I stepped over him and sat down in the living room. Tammy finally ran out of the hallway, drops of water still dripping off her from the shower I had interrupted. She was wearing a short terry robe that barely covered her beautiful ass, and her breasts were visible through the loose front. Under other circumstances, this would have turned me on, but not today. She stopped in the hallway, looking at me, unable or unwilling to speak. I nodded towards her unconscious lover, who was lying in the lobby wearing only his boxers. "Sit down, Tammy. We need to discuss something," I said, pointing to the couch as I stood up to close the front door, stepping over the bastard who had been having sex with my wife for at least a year. "Why couldn't you just come clean at home, Tammy?" "Well, I guess there's no point in asking that question, since you clearly had no intention of leaving him." Dolberg began to stir, and Tammy rushed to his aid. "Max, that was completely unnecessary. What were you even thinking about?" I looked at her in bewilderment. "I was thinking about him having sex with your cheating ass in my bed or his or wherever. That's what I was thinking." I dropped the yellow envelope on the coffee table and watched as her eyes widened. "Max, it's not what you think." I cut it off and headed down the corridor to the only damn bedroom in this apartment, where I saw a freshly fluffed bed and their clothes scattered on the floor. Tammy, meanwhile, sat Dolberg down on the sofa, where he lay in some kind of fog. "I was honest, Tammy. Half of our savings for the last 12 years since we got everything done. We both have our own pension savings, so everything is simple. I had a house before you, and you have a bungalow in West Ashley. I'll make it simple. Sign the papers, and I'll move your things to the other side of town." She looked as if death had struck her, carving out the top floor in a bloodbath, and Dolberg sat with his face swollen and red. I felt his jaw crack as my fist hit the target. "Max, let me go home, talk, and try to fix everything, please." I just shook my head. "Tammy, I almost fell in love with you the moment I first saw you. And honestly, I still love you, but you tore my heart out with that action. I can never trust you again. How the hell could I? It could have been 30 men instead of 3. I'll never know, and it doesn't matter now. No, you killed us, and I don't see a way back." "You can't say that, Max. You can't." I looked at her, barely covered by her robe, in an apartment thousands of miles from home, with the smell of sex still hanging in the bedroom air. I nodded toward Jim Dolberg and shook my head. "Jesus Christ. Don't come home, Tammy. There will be nothing for you there. The girls will find out that you are now persona non grata on Anson Street. Just sign the papers and continue the life you lived in my absence." I turned around before she could see the tears in my eyes and walked away. On the stairs, I looked back, and she was standing in the doorway, crying. I continued walking, trying to get away before the local police arrested me for the bastard I pretended to be. The next day, it was a long, quiet flight back to Charleston. The local police never showed up at the hotel, and I left Vancouver with a troubled mind and an even more uncertain future. No matter how much I tried to calm myself down or thought about what she had done, I still loved Tammy, despite the almost animalistic passion and desire I felt for Kirsten. However, I knew that the door had just slammed shut on a 20-year relationship with my wife and lover. There was still 1 pint left in the jug as I looked at the numbers on the papers in front of me. In 3 months, my 30 years of service would have been completed, and if I continued to work, it would be for the sake of money and not for the sake of increasing my pension. Health insurance isn't going to get any better by staying at 8 to 20, so to be practical, I might as well retire and enjoy the life of a city gentleman. Apparently, I wasn't very practical. My love for the sea meant more to me, and in the end, I decided to stay with the company for another year. Max, I'm sorry to hear about your problems with Tammy. You had a long history. Satch spoke as sincerely as possible. He himself tried to improve his family life 3 times, but to no avail. Yes, everything is fine. We will both survive this and move on in whatever direction, I answered. I lied. For me, it was not okay at all. When I returned from Vancouver, I painfully packed all of Tammy's things and hired a truck to take them to her sister's bungalow, as promised. Sailors don't cry, or so it is written in some manual. I was stoic and determined right up until the moment when I had to empty her drawers and put away their contents. Then I couldn't hold on anymore. These fools who imagine the purification of the soul through burning things have never loved a woman the way I loved her. They talk about it, about revenge, about getting their share of the flesh, but none of them stand in the ashes of what they did. And I stood in an empty room and cried like a baby, a 6 foot, 200-pound, crying wreck. Then I went to Henry's and got drunk. This drinking brought me out of my stupor, and again I just moved forward, step by step, until it was time to set sail in 2 weeks. The Molly Seine was under sail again, and we were 3 days' sail from Charleston when I lay down on my bunk to check the ship's news and personal mail. Kirsten wrote me letters from time to time, inquiring about my well-being. We discussed our confrontation in detail over the phone one night while she was in New York. Moving from one woman to another is not easy. I would say that this is almost impossible. In our case, there was some inexplicable attraction between Kirsten and me, and she knew that my heart still belonged to another woman. Intentionally or accidentally, she gave Tammy and me a lot of space. This only increased my respect and affection for her. Weeks passed, and still no word from Tammy about signing the papers. After a short layover in Rotterdam, we headed to Bremerhaven, where we stayed for 3 days to unload and load. As soon as the ship was secured, I gave the crew 24 hours leave, leaving the duty watch while I went ashore on personal business. The taxi stopped in front of a 3-story stucco house on Helgelanderstrasse, and as it pulled away, I looked up at the house. For a moment, I noticed a face behind the curtain at the window, and as soon as I pressed the bell, the doors swung wide open. "Max, I've been waiting," she whispered and threw herself into my arms, burying her face in my neck. I had no words at this moment. I just enjoyed the passion and desire I felt for her. Her lips pressed against mine, and we remained standing in the hallway, with the door open leading to the street. "Please come in," she said in a hoarse voice, overcome by desire. Somehow we made it to the living room. She led me into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of cognac, standing next to each other, and we raised a toast to my long-awaited arrival. Having settled down, I looked around her house. It was comfortably furnished with antique furniture, creating an atmosphere of old, conservative luxury. On the mantelpiece were family photographs, including one of her daughter, a stunningly beautiful girl, and another of Denny's Toller with his late wife and mother Kirsten. Dad lives with me and occupies the 3rd floor since Mom died 4 years ago. My sister Lydia stays on the 2nd floor when she comes to town, but this happens less and less since she now has a new boyfriend. She smiled slightly. Well, Marlene and I are on the 1st floor. We sat for a while before heading out for dinner. The more I admired her, the more I felt like a young man who had just met the love of his life. If I had really been young, I would have believed it, but as someone who has lived a life beyond reckless impulses, I knew what complications awaited us, and Kirsten understood this too. Max, when my ex-husband left, a long time passed before I signed the papers, almost 2 years. He was very patient, even though he already had another woman in New York who wanted to marry him. In retaliation, I slept with 3 men and 1 woman, mostly out of revenge, although I secretly hoped he would return. He never returned, and Lydia convinced me to sign. And then he suddenly wanted to return. I didn't accept him anymore. He was a fool, I said seriously. Yes, and your wife too, since she threw you out like that. Her divorce was a completely different story. They both let their marriage fall apart before they found themselves in the arms of others, and accusations were common. If I had known how bad it was, I would have acted quickly to fix Tammy's situation, but hindsight is the best thing ever. At that point, it didn't matter whether Tammy signed the papers or not. The court would issue a ruling in any case, and of course, I convinced myself that I would never rush into a new relationship again. Her eyes sparkled with playfulness as she came and sat on my lap. "Let's stay at home," she whispered in my ear. Having placed a soft pillow under her and made herself comfortable, Kirsten looked at me, her gaze beckoning and enveloping. She pulled me closer, her voice sounding soft but confident. "Max, come to me. I want to feel you close." Her fingers gently touched my hair. Her movements were full of passion, but remained graceful. I touched her shoulder, and she took a deep breath, enjoying the moment. "You're so good at this, Max. It's incredible." Her hands moved along my back. We dissolved in tenderness. Kirsten leaned back, her face expressing complete delight and satisfaction. "You always know how to make me happy," she whispered, smiling. Her voice was filled with gratitude, and the atmosphere in the room became tense with our emotions. Time seemed to stand still, and we continued to enjoy the intimacy, surrendering to the moment. Later, when my breathing evened out, she gently pulled me towards her and said quietly, "Thank you for always understanding me and giving me these unforgettable moments." Her words filled me with warmth, and we both knew that this was not just passion, but a real connection, full of tenderness and trust. She loved to please me, paying careful attention to every detail. Her caresses were full of sensuality and care, which was impossible not to appreciate. There was a sense of sincerity in her movements, as if she was expressing her emotions through touches and glances. When our bodies merged in a fit of passion, everything else disappeared. I felt how we were becoming one, and this feeling filled me completely. She always knew how to bring me to the point where reality dissolved, giving way to magic. Her beauty was mesmerizing. Curvaceous forms, soft lines, everything about her attracted and excited. Her passionate look and sincere laugh made me forget about everything in the world. She was my dream come true. Each of our moments together became a separate story, filled with tenderness, passion, and love. She made me feel truly alive, and her presence inspired me every day. The slow ceiling fan above us continued to spin as we lay there, rich and damp, silent for a moment, albeit short-lived. "Max, did you say that you studied to be an engineer? In Castine, right? In New England?" "Yes, it was the Maine Maritime Academy in Castine, Maine. A beautiful little place on the coast of Maine. I'll show you on the map as soon as I can. I wouldn't just like to see it. I'd like to visit Maine. Dad says it's a lot like Norway, but with a rockier, wilder coastline. Sounds like a wonderful place. Maybe you'll take me there someday." I nodded and smiled, both externally and internally. I couldn't imagine a better time than holed up in a cabin in northeastern Maine on vacation with this woman. When I was younger, I always dreamed of going back to Castine or even Vinalhaven Island. It was a romantic idea, not always practical, so I kept it in the back of my mind all these years. I have many pleasant memories of this place. It's wonderful in the summer, although it can be a little dreary in the winter. Maybe we'll go there on one of my free shifts. Her eyes shone again. In the morning, Kirsten prepared me an old-fashioned German breakfast that suited my tastes. These were open-faced egg and ham sandwiches on rye bread, black coffee, and pastries. "Dennis is not here?" I asked, noticing his absence. "Oh no, he's in Hamburg at a conference." I felt some relief knowing that he was not there while I made love to his daughter, to her very loud calls. She just grinned, as if she read my thoughts. "Where are you going next?" she asked. "We are waiting in line to go through Suez, unfortunately. Dad says captains hate it, most of them." He's right. We could be stuck in Port Said for a long time if something goes wrong. But the good news is that my rotation here in Bremerhaven ends in 5 weeks. This means that I will have 6 weeks of rest at the very beginning of the summer. I could imagine the gears turning in her head, but I needed to finish my business and get back to the ship. We said goodbye for a long time, and she took me to the pier on the embankment, where I relieved my watch officer. I watched as 4 men climbed aboard Molly Sane through the starboard entrance, each with a black sports backpack and gray knitted hats. They behaved rather reservedly, busy securing their belongings in the forward hold and assessing the conditions on deck. These were employees of a private maritime security company, mercenary specialists whom many shipping companies began to hire for voyages across the Indian Ocean due to Islamic pirates operating in the Gulf of Aden, in the Mozambique Channel area, and even on the ocean side of Madagascar, near St. Denis on Reunion. We were carrying cargo destined for Athens, South Africa, and Argentina. Otherwise, I would have avoided the Horn of Africa route at all costs. Captain, Port said, has given us the go-ahead for direct passage through the canal as soon as we pass Zachros, my first mate reported. This was good news for keeping on schedule. This meant that most of the merchant ships were behind us, and we would be allowed into the canal without waiting. As we passed, Port said, the guards became much more active, taking up observation positions as we traveled south. Pirates were not uncommon in the Indian Ocean, but even more worrying were radical Islamists on both shores, although the Egyptian army kept the situation firmly under control in most areas. We reached the Red Sea without incident and continued south, approaching the coast of Somalia until the bridge reported activity. On the port side, a small trawler was launching 2 motorboats, each carrying 5 or 6 people, maybe more if you consider who was in the bow. "Captain, they're shooting at us," my second mate shouted. We heard a rapid series of bangs on the port side of the bridge until several guards opened fire on one of the approaching boats. The crew had already left the deck to safety. Only me, 5 officers and guards remained above the deck. Then all hell broke loose as the missile flew past the bridge, narrowly missing the first container stack, just 10 feet below us. "Damn it, everyone behind the partition," I shouted, ordering my men to take positions behind the protective wall installed on the bridge for such cases. It was not a safe room, but rather a protective barrier. The guards opened fire with heavy machine guns on the trawler, firing a series of powerful salvos. As the first rocket flew by, one of the guards fired what I was later told was a grenade launcher Carl Gustav M3 Mawas. He managed to fire his shell a moment before the second missile from the trawler struck the stern on the port side, shaking us from stem to stern. Fortunately, the blow was not serious. The trawler, on the other hand, received a direct hit on its fuel tank and exploded, breaking into 2 pieces in a fireball. At that moment, all 4 guards opened fire on the 2 boats, and within seconds both of them were surrounded by black smoke and flames. We saw terrorists jumping into the warm waters, perhaps hoping that we would save their poor souls from certain death at sea drowning or encountering sharks. But Molly Sane was traveling at a full speed of 23 knots. I had no intention of slowing down, much less turning back, for the sake of those who had just tried to seize our ship with missiles and gunfire. We were in international waters, and although I reported to the head office, I was the law on board. We were under no obligation to anyone except to notify the nearest maritime authorities friendly to us of what had happened. While the ship remained afloat, we did not stop for a soul until we reached Cape Town. "Captain, one of my men has a slight wound to his left arm. He is already being treated. 2 of us have collected all the shell casings we can find, and, with your permission, we will regroup and prepare to continue our voyage. We are still at risk," a young guard who looked to be about 30 reported to me. He reminded me of one of the Navy instructors I knew in school. He was right. There was a long road ahead of us. That's when the adrenaline started to wear off, and I had to sit down. Expecting something like this is one thing, but experiencing it in reality is completely different. Then I decided that enough was enough. 2 rotations in a row with serious incidents. First the incident with Kirsten, and now this damn terrorist attack by pirates. I decided that I would inform the head office that I was going to stop doing this type of work. 3 weeks later, we were crossing the English Channel on our way to Bremerhaven. The guards disembarked in Cape Town and flew to a new assignment in Indonesia. We had minimal damage to the stern rail and 2 damaged containers. In general, everything worked out fine. However, my Portuguese crew had a different opinion. One of the seniors said that more than half the crew would quit as soon as we reached shore. "They are not soldiers," he added. "Who are they?" I thought, opening the letter that my lawyer sent me a couple of days before. The plane landed at Charleston International Airport. It was the second leg of the flight from Frankfurt via Dulles, and I took Uber to get to the peninsula. My old neighbor, Mr. Shields, had planted a new row of roses along his windows, and they were in full bloom. "Your girls have been a great help, Mr. Banyan. Good girls, both," he said as I handed him his favorite pastries from Kaminsky's. "One of the best," I smiled, heading towards the iron gates. The master soldered the latch well, and everything was strong again. I pinched some wilted flowers along the path leading to the back door. With a fresh cup of coffee, I began to sort through the email and attached letter from my lawyer that I had received a few days ago. Tammy still hadn't signed the papers, instead insisting on a so-called second chance meeting at my house. She returned to Charleston a couple of weeks ago. Apparently, her months-long dalliance with adultery had come to an end. By the time I read her platitudes for the 100th time, I was literally boiling with anger and immediately rejected the idea of meeting at home. I just couldn't imagine under what circumstances we could put up with her infidelity, and now, with my affair with Kirsten, things were even more complicated, and it just seemed ridiculous. However, I called my lawyer to arrange a meeting on neutral territory. I wanted a barbecue, so he made an appointment at the Bessingers on the west side of Ashley. I filled a 4-compartment styrofoam container with a mountain of pulled pork, ribs, and trimmings, then took one of the outdoor picnic tables and asked the waitress for a pitcher of sweet tea. It might have been an unpleasant meeting, but I was going to eat like the king of the South. Tammy joined me a few minutes later with a much smaller portion. We have to give her credit. If this was a date, I'd already be in bed with her, driven by pure lust. She was wearing a summer dress with several buttons undone that would otherwise have been fastened. The hem was quite short, revealing her muscular legs, and her firm breasts clearly hinted that she was fishing for her husband. What she didn't expect was my imagination, an imagination that imagined her with another man, white macho Jim Dolberg roasting her in his cozy little Vancouver apartment while her dress was hiked up at her waist. I suppressed a slight smile, remembering the state of his jaw. "Tammy, this is your meeting," I muttered, holding a piece of crunchy sauce ball between my teeth. She wasted no time. "I want to go home, Max," she said, pausing to gauge my reaction. "I want to go home and try to get back what I stupidly and recklessly lost. I know that I will have to go through a long and difficult path, but I ask you to give me this chance." She didn't realize that this simply meant she wanted to go back to that rainy day on Anson Street and replay everything. But I was against it. I reached for the plastic bottle of Carolina hot sauce and dribbled some onto my fork. "Remember the Christmas party a year and a half ago? The one where Jim Dolberg kept holding mistletoe over the head of any woman he might catch, including you. Then he already had sex with you, didn't he? I was recently reminded of this. This little bastard knew where the bathroom was on the 2nd floor. Damn it, he knew where everything was, didn't he? You exposed your first-class body to him for a long time, and now you think that all you need to do is go through the hard way." I took a bite of my pulled pork sandwich and savored the taste as I waited for her answer. I know it sounds flippant, but she had already broken my heart, and I wasn't going to shed any more tears. I had other questions. "I want to know about that bastard Thomas Pryor. How the hell did he end up in your bed, considering you already had Dolberg tucking you into bed on a regular basis?" Tammy was on the verge of tears, but held them back. "Thomas blackmailed me," she said in a quiet voice. "He caught Jim and me together after class and threatened to tell you. He had a video on his phone. My God, Max, I didn't want any of this. Things were getting out of control with Jim, and then there was Thomas. I didn't think twice, and when Jim told me to go to Vancouver to get away from it all, I thought that would be the end of it. I didn't know Jim would come next. I was weak in front of him. He has such an influence on women, I don't know what it is. I know what it is, Tammy. This is a cheating wife for a year and a half. It started before that Christmas party, didn't it? She didn't need to answer. I saw it on her face. I half expected it to be some kind of blackmail, because I just couldn't imagine Tammy willingly sleeping with that bastard. I decided that I would deal with this later. Tammy, I don't see that anything has changed since we were in Vancouver. In fact, this meeting turned out to be a complete waste of time for me. Max, we've been together for over 20 years. You can't just throw everything away like that. Go and have an affair, have sex with one of the students. God, a couple of them are constantly drooling over you. I'll give you carte blanche. Hell, I'll give you a tenner, even though I'll hate every minute of it. But we just can't throw it all away. She was already crying, but still didn't understand. I'd forgive her for Anson Street if she'd just tell me and stop it all. Instead, she made a cuckold out of me for another 6 months. I threw this term at her. She knew what this meant for the male ego. Cuckold with your damn stallion. You had sex with him right in my bed when the girls were at home. It was Dolberg's cool mountain wind, wasn't it? I think you even used my pillow under your naked bottom while he had sex with you. Jesus Christ. She didn't deny anything. I just sat there, crying, realizing the hopelessness of the situation. Tell me, Tammy, why did you even start with him? You know the old saying, curiosity killed the cat. Everything that others said about him was true, that he was as healthy as a stallion and twice as skilled. I thought I could limit myself to one time to get rid of the itching, but it was like a very severe addiction. Screw it, Tammy. Over all these years, I could have slept with 100 desirable women, kept one in every port, but I didn't do it. She wanted to say, but never said, that once she started cheating, she couldn't stop. I could not know how many of them there were or how many more there would be. The old saying that absence makes love stronger turned out to be complete nonsense in this case. We looked at each other, realizing that this was the end, and I no longer had any appetite, only sadness after 20 years. Perhaps she hoped that I would return when she sorted out her desires. Or maybe she had already figured it out, but I couldn't trust her. I couldn't share my plans with her other than that I wouldn't be around anymore, and that was the end of it. She didn't know anything about Kirsten, and I saw no reason to tell her. What happened to Kirsten happened after I took off the ring, realizing that it was all over. Maximilian's Golden IPA is coming, he announced into the microphone. Satch came closer. Has Fatty sung her song yet? I nodded and took a sip of thin foam. The fat girl not only sang, but the curtain fell. Tammy signed the paperwork, and we settled the accounts, allowing the final decision to go into effect in a few months. Dolberg moved to Toronto. Rumor had it that he stayed as far away from Tammy as possible, but I tried not to think about it. Sophie Pryor divorced her toad, and Thomas moved into a townhouse in North Charleston, not the address he was aiming for. Satch, have you ever thought about leaving everything and going to that island you dream about? Dude, I think about it sometimes, but look at me. I have my place, all these mommies come here, I'm big, black, handsome, and I have my boys, he said, pointing to the saxophone in the corner. He then flashed his signature white-toothed smile. I'll get there someday, man. We bought drinks for the regulars, and I walked out the door, heading towards Anson Street in the light rain. I pressed the bell on the doorframe of a townhouse on Helgelunderstrasse and heard footsteps approaching. When the door opened, standing in front of me was a young girl, a 20-year-old version of Kirsten herself. You must be Marlene, I said, holding out my hand. Yes, Mr. Bunyan. Mom said you'll come over today. Please come in. Call me Max. I followed her into the living room, leaving my bag in the hallway, and she invited me to get comfortable. Having been accustomed for 25 years to renting out rooms to young girls of her age, I encountered varying degrees of beauty and the lack thereof. But Marlene was in a league of her own. Any man who charms this girl should thank his luck for such luck. Mom said she'll be here by lunchtime. She put the tea in front of me and sat down opposite me. She's been very emotional the last few days. It was only a few minutes before the front door opened and Kirsten walked in, seeing us sitting, followed by her father Denny's. She hurried to me, hugged and kissed me, and Denny's shook my hand. Lunch was pleasant, and after the table was cleared, Kirsten and I sat on the patio and enjoyed the moment before putting our bags in the trunk of her car. Marlene was supposed to take us to Frankfurt and Maine and then continue on to Wurzburg. The next day at 10 a.m. we rented a car and headed to Castine on Penobscot Bay. Our flight arrived in Bangor and was an hour away from our destination. I promised Kirsten months ago that I would take her to Maine, and with the fall colors all around us and the warmth of a mild day, it was the perfect season. We had rented a cottage for a week, and all we had to do was buy groceries and get comfortable, except for one thing. "Mr. Bunyan, may I call you Max?" a respectable man asked me. "Of course, and I'll continue to call you Dean Gardner, if you don't mind." We both laughed, and the dean of the Maine Maritime Academy led me into his office overlooking Castine Bay. It all happened by chance. I met an old friend from the academy who ran a cruise ship out of Fort Lauderdale. He called a friend, who called another friend, and eventually the dean contacted me. We were now discussing the final terms of the contract to teach engineering as a visiting professor at the academy. We shook hands, and soon I was driving to a rented cottage near Dice Head Lighthouse. "You signed, right?" Kirsten exclaimed when she saw my beaming face. "Of course I signed it. Did you doubt it?" I answered, picking her up in my arms and carrying her to the soft bed. "I want to make love to you to celebrate." "Try me first." "Try me too." We both laughed at her playful suggestion, and the day passed in a light and relaxed atmosphere. Time seemed to stand still while we enjoyed each other's company, and in the evening, having already cleaned ourselves up, we went to a roadside cafe for a lobster dinner. This was her first acquaintance with such a variety: potatoes, corn, shellfish, and of course, 2-pound lobsters. The next day, we had to decide where we wanted to live and for how long. I still had a house on Anson Street, she still had space in the family home in Bremerhaven, and now I had a part-time job in Castine. We were sitting in Dice Head, looking across the bay at Islesboro Island, when Kirsten said, "Why not there?" "Well, the ferry takes you to the other side of the bay, not here. I would have to take the ferry to Lincolnville and then drive over an hour to get to Castine. I would need my own boat to get here." "Max, you're the captain. It's so simple, isn't it?" She looked at me with that expression that women make when they can't believe how stupid men are about certain things. Later that evening, I was surfing the internet, looking at used boat ads, and found a couple of suitable options. One of them turned out to be perfect. It was a former lobster boat converted into a small pleasure craft for an elderly couple on Vinalhaven. She had a rebuilt Cummins diesel engine with only 200 hours on it. A couple of days and $20,000 later, the boat was mine. Kirsten found a home. It was a white clapboard cottage overlooking Caston and a fairly short walk to the marina where I could rent a place for a boat at a reasonable price. It was not cheap, but 1.5 kilometers to the south, there was a garden and a tavern. I paid a deposit, and the owner allowed me to rent out the house until the transaction was completed. We became official residents of Islesboro. "Jesus, Max, do it like a real sailor," she said with a serious look. I laughed because I wasn't much of a sailor, but she seemed to like it when I played the role. "Damn, this is incredible," she breathed, releasing the tension, and her lips were at my throat. "Minx. Dumb sailor." We relaxed, enjoying the silence, broken only by the cries of seagulls outside the open window. "Do it again," she said, smiling slyly. This is how the remaining days of our stay passed. I completed a 6-week pipe installation course for first-year students and was also assigned the duties of supervising work aboard the TS State of Maine Maritime Academy training vessel in port. I needed to pack everything up for Thanksgiving and the holidays, so Kirsten and I decided to go to Charleston and then fly back to Germany. Anson Street was full of tourists and students strolling through the shops and establishments. Satch recommended a friend of his to manage the property in my absence, and the girls who rented the house turned out to be quite reliable. I turned the key in the lock and entered. It was as if I had never left. I told the girls in advance that they could use the first floor if they kept things tidy, and they did, with the exception of a pair of lilac and pink panties lying near the stairs, apparently an accidental sloppiness in the laundry. I winked at Kirsten. After a long day of travel, we ordered Chinese takeout, opened a bottle of wine, and, after enjoying some slow, tender love in bed, went to bed. Only one of the girls was home that morning. The others had gone home for the holidays, so we invited her to celebrate Thanksgiving with us at Caroline's, a trendy East Bay restaurant, along with Satch and a couple of other old friends. Everyone had a great time. After dinner, we invited the whole company to our home. Satch and I sat on the porch enjoying a good cigar and a bottle of top-notch bourbon. "Listen, I've been keeping my eyes open for a job for you. You know, your ex caused a scandal at college. She accused her boss of sexual harassment, and then several other teachers also came forward with accusations. It was even written in the newspapers. They say he will either resign or be kicked out." "That damn Toad Pryor," I grinned, tasting the bourbon on my lips. "Yeah, well, your ex isn't in the best shape either. She's been drinking for months on end since you broke up. She was at my bar a week ago, drunk, asking about you, and then left with some womanizer. That's always been her problem, Satch. She loved other people's men too much. It's surprising that she hasn't tried to seduce you yet." He looked at me with slight surprise, and then I understood. "She tried, didn't she? Damn it," I laughed. "Did you sleep with her?" "No, man, you and I have known each other for too long for me to do that. She is, of course, beautiful, and if she were someone else's woman, I would have taken the chance long ago, but she is a heavy load, and as long as you both live, she is still your wife, even if you are divorced." "So what about your fair lady? Are you and Kirsten going to get married?" Maybe it was the bourbon, or maybe it was the dreamy thoughts floating in the cigar smoke. I would have married Kirsten if we were both ready for that step, but neither she nor I were going down that path right now. We were adult divorcees enjoying life. Why complicate things? Satch, I don't know. Maybe one day it will happen, but for now I like living as I do now. Here in Maine and even in Europe. Everything is going great. Let's see. Tammy would crawl on her knees across glass if she had the chance. Yes, she would do it, but she would have to get off some big man she was enjoying before she could do anything. We both laughed about it, but there was a sad feeling inside. Tammy and I discussed what we needed months ago, but her path continued to bother me. I've never looked at love as something you can just turn on and off, and I've never wanted it. We have been one for too many years to treat this as something ordinary. It's been a long time since I went to the Ashley River Moors bungalows. I think the last time was when Tammy wanted to renovate it before her sister moved out after her marriage broke down. Now the sisters live together. I stood at the door after ringing the bell for a few moments before Patty walked around the house with the baby in her arms. This was new. "Hello, Max. If you're looking for Tammy, she's not here." "Everything is fine. Actually, I wanted to talk to you." "Listen, I don't want to interfere in what happened between you," she began, but I interrupted her gently. "That's not the point. She's your sister, and I'm concerned about what I heard." Patty turned away, biting her lip. "I heard that things aren't going well for her, and I'd like to help if I can." She invited me to the backyard patio and offered me sweet tea. "She knows you're seeing someone, Max, and I think that's what led to her downfall. I don't know what to do. She goes drinking every evening and started bringing men here until I told her that this is unacceptable around a child. I want to offer her something, and she will understand that this means that she will have to stop drinking. I want her to become a housewife for the girls in the house. There are 4 people living there now, and I'm thinking of adding 2 more, but I need someone in charge to look after them and manage things." "I thought you already had someone looking after the house," Patty asked, perplexed. "I have a person who makes sure that utility bills are paid and that everything that is broken is repaired. But with 6 students living together, it would be nice if they had a home tutor from the staff who was around occasionally. I saw Patty's thoughts begin to work in her head. We both knew Tammy was not an alcoholic. It was her crutch, and she needed another, at least for a while. I'll deal with the consequences later, but that could wait. "What is the boy's name?" I asked. At first, she looked confused. "Oh, sorry, Max. I should have introduced him to you when you arrived. It's Charlie, long story, but I won't bore you with it." She tried to laugh, but she didn't succeed very well. I could only guess. Patty agreed to talk to Tammy and ask her to call me if she was interested. The call did not take long to arrive. The sisters talked, and Tammy said how much she missed being with the girls. She was depressed and didn't mention Kirsten or try to get any information. We set ground rules: no drinking around girls, no men in my house, and mandatory registration with the dean of students as an adjunct tutor. It was this last point that kept her from making mistakes. If she were to commit serious misconduct, it would put her teaching position in jeopardy. She would have to take control of her behavior and actions. Whether she saw this as an opportunity to maintain a connection with my life or not did not matter at that moment. She had no intention of moving into the house, and her interaction with the girls was to be limited to 2 or 3 visits a week. Besides, I was going to Maine myself with Kirsten. "You know you'll have to deal with her again sooner or later, right?" Kirsten asked me one evening in bed before our flight. "Maybe. Let's see," I answered. The sky above was a brilliant blue, and the morning sun rose towards midday as we bobbed on the ocean waves. A little girl was trying to open a container on the deck that I had just lifted out of the water, but she was so persistent in her attempts that I just sat and watched her efforts. She had a stubborn expression on her face and wore elbow-length gloves on her hands. When the lid finally gave way, she climbed inside. I'm sure the dark green crustacean with large claws had other plans, but the girl pulled it out and threw it into the white plastic bucket at her feet with the 4 others we had caught earlier. We were about 100 yards from the dock. 8 of my yellow and black boys held the lobster pots on the ocean floor. The girl's mother stood on the pier and watched us without taking her eyes off. The little girl, Etta, waved to her mom as we headed toward the parking lot. Etta was named after her grandmother Marlene and mother Kirsten, and despite her age of 6, she was unusually smart in everything. "Be careful, Etta," Marlene shouted. I lifted the girl out of the boat, and she ran to her mother, and I returned to my work, securing the gear and getting dinner. I stopped for a moment on the pier and looked out to sea at the far shore, which was a mile away. I returned home to where I had once been in my youth, experiencing the hardships of growing up and becoming an adult. 60 years quickly approached, and Kirsten and I settled in Islesboro. She would turn 50 in the fall, and she still looked as delicious as when I first saw her. She knew how to warm me up by rubbing my back a certain way, and still loved to grab onto the old headboard for late-night rides. We haven't been back to Charleston since I sold the house on Anson Street a couple of years ago to the College of Charleston. It is now used as housing for arts and humanities students. Tammy played a key role in orchestrating this deal when she took on the significant role of the new dean of faculty. She quit drinking completely and still lives with her sister in West Ashley, helping raise her nephew Charlie. According to Patty, she hasn't been in a serious relationship since we got divorced. Satch sold Henry's house and invested a small portion of the proceeds in a dive bar in Key West, taking with him a pretty blonde half his age. I still don't know how he decided to do this a 4th time, but they seemed happy when they came here last summer. It was a mild summer evening as Kirsten and I walked along our village path on the island, heading to the tavern for sale. We arrived at the community church and meeting hall building on the north side of the island. They both stopped and stood for a moment, looking at him. "Do you think it will do?" "Well, it doesn't have a spire, but it's white," she replied, and we continued our walk to the tavern. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.